Okay, our next podcast is going into biological molecules. So we have talked about carbon and these large carbon molecules, organic molecules. And so now we are going into some of these, and we're going to look at these large molecules and what functional role they play in living organisms. So there's four major classes of these large biological molecules, and sometimes they're called macromolecules because they can be very large. Here we see a kind of a computer animation, and this is often done to describe some of these structures of these large molecules like proteins. Um, but there's four major classes of these, and three of the four are polymers. So a polymer is a long molecule consisting of similar building blocks. So an analogy of that would be like a train. You have the train is a long polymer of cars. The individual cars on the train are called monomers. So in our molecule, the molecule is made up of a bunch of monomers, which are smaller building blocks of the molecule, sets of atoms. So of these four major classes of molecules, important life molecules, three of them are polymers: carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. There's one other group of these large macromolecules that are important, and they're referred to as lipids, but lipids are not polymers. All right, so um, we can start by saying kind of how these polymers form in the cell, and they can form through a process that involves water, and they can separate um, through a process that involves water, and those processes are called dehydration and hydrolysis. So dehydration is, well, if you get dehydrated, it means that you have lost water out of your body. And so that term means the same for molecules. When the molecule loses water, then this is the process where water comes together. So here's an example of a short polymer here. It has three monomers to it. And here's one unlinked monomer. And it has an HO here. And this has a hydrogen attached on this end with a bond. And so when this molecule comes in contact with each other, this HO and the hydrogen here can hook together and give us two hydrogens and an oxygen, and that could separate. When this separates from the two molecules, it then bonds this monomer to that polymer. Then the water is free. And so we have a new bond that has formed, and now we have four monomers in our polymer. It has increased in length. So that's a dehydration reaction in the synthesis of a polymer. Okay, and so that's how it can build, but also these large polymers can shrink. And that is when water comes in and the water separates and a hydrogen goes here and the HO goes over here. And it breaks this bond. So when water comes in, it breaks the bond holding monomer 3 and monomer 4 together. The hydrogen goes over here with the original polymer, and the HO goes over here with the monomer. And this is called hydrolysis, and it breaks a bond. All right, so that's how kind of the polymers can form and break apart in our cells. Now we want to go into these four major molecules of these of living organisms. The first one we're going to look at are carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are can be very complex. There's simple carbohydrates, and there is large what are called polysaccharides, or that have many monosaccharides that attach to it. So in this we can call, let's look at one of these. Okay, here's one right here. So this is an example of showing you, let's see, that's a 2, 3, that's a 6 carbon sugar there. So it has 6 carbons here. It also forms a ring, and this is showing you in the ring formula here. So that's a linear and ring forms of that molecule, and here's abbreviated structure. So that is a simple single sugar, or a mono. It's also referred to as a monosaccharide. Mono referring to one, so it's a simple sugar. We can have 2 of these that hook together. Here's an example right here. Again, through that dehydration process, we can have 2 sugars that hook together, and when they do, this forms a disaccharide, di referring to 2. So here's an example, glucose. Glucose is a very important molecule, carbohydrate, simple carbohydrate that we'll talk about. It's a fuel molecule. But 2 glucose molecules can come together through dehydration and form maltose, which is a disaccharide. So that shows an example of combining of those 2 monosaccharides. Here's another example here of glucose and fructose forming sucrose, which is a disaccharide. All right, so those are disaccharides. We can also get into some large polysaccharides. Poly means many, so we got 2 here, that's di. So when we have 3 or more that hook together, we refer to that as polysaccharide. And there's some common polysaccharides that we see in nature. We have starches. Starches are found in plants, and they consist pretty much of just a bunch of glucose monomers hooked together. And so starch is one, glycogen is another one. Glycogen is a polysaccharide that's found in animals, and starch is found in plants. So each one of these rings right here is representing a glucose molecule. And so we have a bunch of these that hook together to form this long chain here of these to form that polysaccharide. Okay, so let's see. So that's some polysaccharides. Here we see this in plant cell walls are going to have a lot of these polysaccharides that form these fibers, and they wrap around each other here in this case. So each one of these is represented by a single monosaccharide. Another structural polysaccharide that we see is in animals, and we see this one in arthropods. It's in the exoskeleton of arthropods. So arthropods don't have an internal skeleton like we do. So when they grow, they have an external skeleton, and when they grow, they have to shed that external skeleton and then grow a new one. So this is when their exoskeleton has a polysaccharide called chitin in it. And so here, this cicada right here is molting, it's releasing its exoskeleton. It'll grow a new one. It's a very strong material. It's a skeleton on outside their body. It's a very strong material, and it's so strong that the medical practice often use this naturally found polysaccharide to make surgical thread because it is so strong and it is flexible. So that's an example of a polysaccharide. Okay, so that's our first group of major molecules. Our second group of major molecules that we're going to look at are our lipids. Lipids are the one class that is not a polymer. So it's not a bunch of repeating units that forms lipids. Some characteristics of lipids is that they are hydrophobic, they repel water, and they consist mainly of hydrocarbons. And they're some of the most important ones are fats, phospholipids, and steroids. So some of the fats are important. We have uh, different types of fats. All right, so we have some fats that are called saturated fats, and this shows an example of that right here. Saturated fat, that's its molecular structure. Now they have these fatty acid chains, and this fatty acid chain is straight in our saturated fat, and this fatty acid chain, it has a bend in it because of a double bond. See the two lines right there? That's the only difference in the fatty acid chain of this molecule. And so in this molecule, we call this a unsaturated fat because of that bend. And that bend in the fatty acid chain prevents these molecules from forming tight fits with each other, and therefore it remains a liquid. So unsaturated fat is liquid. Saturated fat is solid, like this stick of butter here. And so that's why the saturated fats are more unhealthy for you, because they also stick together in your arteries, as this some of this can get into your bloodstream. All right, so that is one example of a lipid, are these fats. Some other examples are waxes, steroids, phospholipids. This is a very important molecule. We'll talk a lot about this coming up, but it has fatty acid chains. One has a bend in it. It also has a head structure that has a phosphate group in it. And so in this is our functional group, the phosphate. Remember that we talked about in our last podcast. And this structure is found in all of the membranes of every cell, plants and animals, and everything has these around its cell, phospholipids. This is the kind of the symbol that is used in your text to describe these phospholipids. It has a head structure where the phosphate is, and then two tails for the fatty acids. So this makes up our membranes, and we can see this shows an example of our membrane where there's two layers of these that come together. Those tails that I just mentioned meet together in the middle of the membrane, and then the heads, which are hydrophobic, they kind of repel water and keep water from getting in or out of our cells. So it's a very important design that our cells have with these phospholipids, and we'll be talking a lot more about that as we move forward. Okay, we have two more groups of major biological molecules. We'll have to pick it up in the next podcast. But our two last groups are going to be proteins and then our nucleic acids, including our DNA in there. So we'll pick those last two up in our next podcast.